What is up, everybody? Today, here with a short video on the soul, specifically in Thomas Aquinas. So, when we talk about the soul nowadays, we are often thinking in terms of Descartes. So, really, what I want you to do is to start by considering something interesting, which is that in ancient philosophy, the soul was seemingly taken for granted. So, for instance, if you look at Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, you'll notice that the existence of the soul is never argued for. What is argued over is whether or not the soul is immortal. So, this is quite interesting. Why is it then, we can ask ourselves, why is it that in ancient philosophy, the existence of the soul was seemingly taken for granted? Well, that's because in ancient philosophy, the soul is approached in an extremely different way. So, let's think about this here for a sec. And I want you to think about the plants and the animals outside. What is the difference between a dog that's running around, a squirrel, and let's say a plant that's growing? What's the difference between those things and just organic or inorganic matter, just a rock? Well, it seems like the difference between living things, such as plants and animals, and non-living things is the fact that the living things are embodying some sort of principle of movement, some sort of aliveness, you could say. So living things seem to be different than non-living things in that they have their own principle of movement, their own intentions, their own goals. The tree, its roots grow, the rain takes in, or the tree's leaves take in water, it goes through the process of photosynthesis, all this stuff. The animal goes out, searches for food. So that seems to be the difference between a living and a non-living thing right there, is that principle of movement. And then we can now ask ourselves, well, what seems to be the difference between a living squirrel or a living plant and a dead one? Again, there's some sort of living principle going on here. There's some sort of something that makes the thing to be alive. That is what the ancient philosophers thought the soul was. So let me say this. This is the definition of the soul that you can write down. The soul in ancient philosophy is simply the principle of life. It's the difference between living and non-living things. So this might come as a shock to a lot of you. It should. And I hope that it does, because it's so radically different than the way we think about soul today. Again, the soul for ancient philosophers is simply the difference between living and non-living. So of course everybody takes the soul for granted in ancient philosophy. You can't not do that. If you affirm, let me say that in another way, if you affirm that there's a difference between a plant and a rock, and if you affirm that there's a difference between a corpse of a squirrel and a squirrel, whatever that difference is, that is the soul. The soul is simply what makes a thing to be alive. It's the principle of movement, the principle of life. That is the soul, okay? For ancient philosophy. As to what that exactly means, huge complex story, but right now just focus on thinking about this. Now let's contrast this to help you understand it better. Let's contrast this with the modernized view. So the classic example is the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze. Classic example of the modern view of the soul. Now, in this movie, Patrick Swayze is essentially, he's just a disembodied spirit. And you see him running through subway cars, all sorts of stuff. Now, people nowadays, they think that that is what we mean when we refer to the soul. So people think that when I speak of the soul, when you speak of the soul, whatever, that we're referring to this disembodied spirit that we all have. As Gilbert Ryle famously put it, a ghost in the machine. There's a great SpongeBob meme that goes around where Plankton is in a robot controlling the robot. And that is actually just a perfect representation of what the modern conception of the soul is. It's this disembodied spirit that sits in the body and controls it with like levers or something. And this really stems from Descartes. And Descartes argued that the soul and the physical world constitute two separate substances. So there's a res cogitans, which is the soul. It's this immaterial substance. and there's the extended world. So there are two separate substances. And so what you have for Descartes is you have the physical substance, the body, and the soul, which is this immaterial substance which controls it. Now, notoriously, tons of problems with this. There's the interaction problem. There's the problem of why we even need a body at all that Princess Elizabeth raises to Descartes, and so on and so on. But that's the modern view. And again, this modern view is really that there are two separate substances. There's the immaterial soul substance, and there is the physical material world, and they interact somehow, okay? And this is just absolutely laden in our discourse. I mean, everywhere you turn, people refer to the soul as a thing, as this ghost in the machine. So if you look at all sorts of media, whether it be Twitter, Instagram, memes, movies, TV shows, a lot of music contains references to this. If you think about this, and this is actually a good piece of advice, is to think about this Cartesian view of the soul, and just spend a week thinking about, go about your daily life, spend a week trying to notice it in our world. I mean, it's so unbelievably everywhere in our discourse. It's even in modern science. I mean, so many articles about how neuroscience has disproved the soul exists, articles about how people, their bodies are weighed after they die, and they have like a less of a weight, and so people take that as evidence of some sort of immaterial substance that has left their body, and they call it the soul. I mean, this is absolutely everywhere. And again, fundamentally, this is just a total misconception, especially from a Platonic, Aristotelian standpoint. I mean, totally wrong. And obviously that claim needs to be argued for, which I think it can, and which you have to go through a lot of process to do so. But what I think that you can start to realize, at least, is that for Aquinas specifically, following Aristotle's De Anima, following Plato, following this entire tradition, while there are differences between those people, but at least for this ancient tradition, it is so radically different than the moderns. And so their conception of the soul is just utterly, totally different than what our media and our modern philosophers, such as Descartes and Hobbes, portray the soul as being. So, I don't want to hear anybody in the comment section below start to, bring up all this stuff, because when I use the term soul, again, I'm not referring to a separate immaterial substance. I am not referring to a sort of ghost in the machine, Patrick Swayze type thing. I'm not referring to a ghost. I'm not referring to an élan vital or a vital force, as people put it. I am simply referring to the difference between a living and a non-living thing. The difference between my corpse and me right now is what the ancients called the soul. That simply is what Aquinas calls the soul. If you go and you look at the first couple pages of his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, you're going to see this. The soul is the principle of life. It's what makes a thing to be alive. It is the difference between a living and a dead thing. So with that out of the mind, why don't you pause the video and just sit for a few seconds and think. Think about how radically different this is, because I really don't think you can do enough reflecting on how totally different this Thomistic Aristotelian notion of the soul is compared to what we find in modern philosophy, in modern science, the straw men that modern science is putting forth, and especially in our media and in our culture at large. So pause the video there. Now, let's start to think about what the soul exactly is for Thomas and why it is at all. So I mentioned that for Thomas, the soul is just the difference between my dog and my dog's corpse. That's what it is. But how do we get to this? Well, you can provide a ton of arguments for this, but one very basic thing is to notice this. Notice that there is a difference between what a dog can do when it's alive and what a dog can do when it's dead. Notice that the causal powers of the living thing are not found in the causal powers of the dead or material. So for instance, a living dog, my dog's sitting right there, the living dog has intentions, desires, hunger, it has a reproductive system, it has all these things. It has a principle of self-movement. And all those causal powers, as we call them, are not found in the corpse of the dog. So there, and precisely, this is even more important, those causal powers cannot be reduced to the corpse of the dog. So that gives us a pretty good argument for why exactly, or for the existence of the soul. The soul is just that which is the difference, those causal powers, that unified principle that makes the dog to be a living thing. That just is the soul. And we can get even more technical here, and we can call this the form of a thing. So, let me formalize this argument right here for you, what I just walked through in an informal way. I'm going to read from this outline, which I'll link in the video description below. I give 3 arguments, but I'm only going over the first one here. Let me formalize this argument for you, and so you can have it in a more technical way. So here it is. Those things are specifically distinct whose activities are specifically different and irreducible to each other. Nutrition, growth, reproduction, movement, and rationality are specifically different from and irreducible to non-living things. So living things are specifically different than non-living things. And that difference, we might now ask, is what? Well, whatever that is, that difference is what we call the soul. And again, to get more technical here, that difference is specifically in Aristotelian Thomism, it's called the form. So, the form is what gives rise to and organizes the thing to be. So, for instance, again, my dog sitting here and me, what gives rise to, what actualizes the material into a coherent unity, and then bestows upon that coherent unity the ability to do certain things, such as perceive, move, think, etc. That is the form. So the form is an actualizing principle. It actualizes the material. Think about it. Without any form, and I'm not just talking about shape here, but without any unity, without any coherency at all, without any rationality, I would just be a lump of material. And of course, we can talk about what that would be without any form, and then we get to this whole discussion about prime matter. That's a whole other topic. But in any case, the form here is what is actualizing a thing, making it to be, and that just is the soul. So an interesting consequence of this is that for Thomas and Aristotle and the entire ancient tradition, plants have souls, animals have souls, and humans have souls. Everything that is alive has a soul, because again, the soul is just the difference between what is living and what is not. As to what that entails, well, that's a different topic, because there are different levels of souls, and there are different causal powers to each. But that's enough for now. So let me close by talking about something that is extremely, extremely difficult. And this is going to be, again, hearkening back to the discussion before of the difference between the Cartesian view and the Thomistic view. And so one thing that you have to keep in mind is that it is very difficult to kind of get over this prejudice. And hold on, I lost my train of thought there. Let me see if I can recover it. Yes, okay, so for Descartes, I think one way to approach this, one way to approach the difference between this ancient position and the modern position, is to think about the dialectical context in which each is operating in. So for Descartes, and again for Thomas, they're approaching the soul in very, very different ways. So Thomas is approaching the soul through nature. He's looking out at the world, and he is using Aristotelian principles of form, matter, act, potency to deduce the existence of a living principle, which is just the form of a living thing. So Thomas is approaching the soul fundamentally through the natural world. Again, I can't stress this enough. Aristotle, they're looking at the natural world, and they're noticing that there's a difference between living and non-living things. They're reflecting on that, and they're coming to the conclusion that that is just what we mean by the term soul. For Descartes, he is reflecting on his inner self. Okay, this is Meditations and other texts, but he's reflecting on his inner self, and he's saying, wow, there's a difference between what I am and what everything else is. And so Descartes is operating against nature. That's the biggest difference between Descartes and Thomas, I think, is in their methodological approach to the soul. Descartes is operating on the premise or the assumption that he is fundamentally at odds with nature, it seems. He is an abnormality. You know, he is thinking that there are two things that are opposed to each other: the natural thing and the res cogitans, the thinking thing. So you really have just these two radically distinct approaches. One, for Thomas and Aristotle, you're looking at the natural world and you're saying, look, there's got to be some sort of living principle going on here. And that living principle is just what we mean by the soul. And for Descartes, you're looking at the natural world and you're thinking that the natural world is opposed to the mental world or the thinking world. And so what this seems to entail is that you cannot separate Thomas's account of the soul from his account of nature. And this is where so many people go wrong in failing to try to start to grasp what Thomas is talking, and Thomas and the ancients are talking about, is that they try to just take his principles and his terminology out of his natural philosophy and just talk about it. And what's going to happen is it's going to lead into you confusing hylomorphism or Thomistic Aristotelian accounts of the soul with Cartesian dualism. And it's going to lead in a serious problem in understanding. So to sum that point up, that long digression, to sum that up, what I mean is that because of the radical difference in the way Thomas and Aristotle approach the soul, meaning that they approach it through the natural world, because of that radical difference between them and the Cartesian route of approaching the soul specifically against the natural world, and not turning to nature to investigate it, but turning inward to the self. Because of that clash in methodology, you really cannot divorce the Thomistic Aristotelian language and principles from their entire metaphysical and cosmological system as a whole. And if you do that, you're bound to fall into errors. And one of the errors is you're bound to start to implicitly read in Cartesian ideas and terminology to the Thomistic picture. So with that in mind, that's a good intro. Let me add one more thing before I close, and that is, again, this is crucial, so I hope everybody stayed till this point. But for Thomas, form and matter, meaning here in this context, soul and the principle, the material principle, they're not separable. They're not separable in reality. They're distinct, but they're not separable. And so for Thomas, it does not make any sense whatsoever to speak of the soul existing apart from the body. Now, this may come as a shock to a lot of you. But this is one of the chief differences between Thomistic accounts of the soul and Cartesian accounts of the soul. For the Cartesian, you can easily talk about the soul subsisting outside of the body, etc. And it makes for Christian doctrines of the resurrection and the afterlife a lot more easier to mentally grasp. For Thomas, though, the soul can't exist apart from the body. And this gives rise to a massive challenge for Thomas Aquinas, which is, how can you have an Aristotelian account of the soul, yet still hold the key Christian doctrines about the soul surviving death and going on to be resurrected? That's a challenge for Thomas, and he actually does take that up. And the beginning of a solution to this challenge is to notice crucial differences between levels of the soul. And hopefully I'll get to that some point down the road. That is a massive topic. But again, if you're worried about that, don't be. Thomas comes up with all solutions. But for now, what I want you to focus on is just how different, how different our discourse about the soul is in our culture from the way that I have briefly outlined this ancient Thomistic Aristotelian account of the soul. Think about that, reflect on it, spend the next couple days looking at accounts of the soul in media, in discourse, and notice that, again, just to wrap up here, notice that when we speak of the soul again today, in this modern context, we just think of it as a subsisting mental substance out there. Whereas for Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, it is a fundamentally integrated part of the whole thing, the whole living thing, and it's not separable from that living thing. And because of that, nobody in the ancient world, and I suspect nobody today, can really argue as to whether or not the soul exists, insofar as they acknowledge that there's a difference between living and non-living things. The argument is about what the soul is and whether it survives death. So thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. If you're interested, check out the De Anima of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. That's where this information is coming from, and have a good day.